Alrighty guys, so we're going to look at Countee Cullen here. Countee Cullen is really a significant figure. He was a little bit different than his counterparts in the Harlem Renaissance for a lot of reasons. So unlike someone like Langston Hughes, he didn't play with form or verse. He didn't mirror sort of the cultural and the artistic movement by playing with the ideas of jazz and blues in the same way that a lot of other poets did. He valued the traditional poetic forms, and he thought it was really important and significant to pay homage and really appropriate those forms. Essentially these were forms which were written by white men, and so he's really kind of appropriating these forms for himself and doing something kind of unique with that. He was very well educated. He has a bachelor's and a master's. He was adopted by a preacher at about 15. Went to NYU, became an assistant editor at an African American magazine called Opportunity, and eventually he married W. Du Bois's daughter, and they went to Paris, where he wrote another novel. But during their time there, they actually divorced because Cullen had a fairly well-known attraction to men. So he was, in a sense, a bisexual author of some kind. Though it's never really appeared too much in his works. He also wrote, I said, one more novel, and then he never quite achieved the same success. So he eventually returned to teaching at Frederick Douglass Junior High School in New York, and he actually taught, one of his students was James Baldwin. So the three poems I had you read are fairly famous poems, and I had you read them because they do kind of compare very well to a lot of the other poetry we've read in these last couple weeks. So, Yet Do I Marvel is a very clear sonnet, and what it does is it really plays with the idea of a sonnet where you have 3 quatrains or 12 lines of one idea. And the last 2 lines are a couplet, and they reverse or tend to create a stark contrast to that idea. So the first 12 lines here are a very common theme, where he's talking about sort of the inviolability of God and how he doesn't question God's plan, he doesn't question God's breadth of knowledge, even though the world can be so cruel. And you see we have very clear end rhymes, we have iambic pentameter, so we have a very clear structure here that he's working with. And he says, I don't question why, God is all these wonderful adjectives. He's good, well-meaning, and kind, and I'm just this little, mole. I'm nothing. Why? I don't question why the flesh that mirrors him has to die. So there's meaning in what he does, even though we're suffering. And then when he moves to the idea of suffering in the second quatrain, he brings up this idea of 2 Greek figures. Tantalus and Sisyphus were figures who were tortured by Hades, and they the first had to have food and water given to him and taken away every single day before he could eat it, and the second one was the one who had to roll the stone up the hill and then roll it back down over and over and over again. So there's sort of this idea of fickle is what he calls it, fickleness. We toil, and nothing happens, nothing good happens. And still he doesn't question it. He says we struggle every day. And then he goes back to talking about God, and he says inscrutable and immune. So his mind is so grand, is so holy, and so perfect that we could never understand it. And he says he doesn't think about these petty cares that I do. And he uses this word awful twice. And of course, if you know the biblical reference, awful literally is a sense of grandeur, it's a sense of awe, it's a sense of greatness, as well as the way we use the word awful. So he's really playing with that idea of awful. And he says, yet do I marvel. That yet signals the turn right here, and this is really important. Yet as in but. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. So what he does at the end is he twists the whole thing on his head. He's been saying, I have faith in God, I have faith in God, I have faith in God. However, I don't understand why he would make a poet African American and why he would bid him sing. So he's saying there's almost a cruelty in putting this artistic fervor inside of him. And why does God do this? Why does God do this, knowing that the only cruelty can come to me because of it, is what he's saying. Okay, so Heritage is a very long poem, and I'm going to walk you guys through it as quickly as I can. But Heritage, as you can tell, it's not a sonnet, but it is has clear rhythm and a clear rhyme scheme that is iambic. So we have the da 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 over and over again. And what this does is, you'll see down here, I said that it really paints this sort of rhythmic beat, which is really important because what he's doing is he's talking about his roots in Africa. And I did this poem because I want you guys to kind of think about how it might compare to something like the poem Africa that we read. So, Claude McKay's Africa. So, what he starts out with here is this question: what is Africa to me? Scarlet, copper sun or scarlet sea, jungle star or jungle track, strong bronzed men or regal black. So we have these beautiful, noble images here. These are positive, strong images, masculine images. And then he switches to the idea of women from whose loins I sprang when the birds of Eden sang. So Africa, he's saying, is rooted in this, and it's the heart of all, the cradle of civilization. Of essentially, it's Eden. It's a biblical reference. It's where he comes from. It's where all civilization comes from. And then he has this italicized quatrain where he repeats this quatrain later, so it's really important. And he says, 3 centuries removed. So all of these many hundreds of years have passed. What is Africa to me? I don't know what it is because I'm not there. It's in my blood. And he says, so I lie who's all day long. And then he goes on and on, and he gives this sort of idyllic image of Africa. And he's struggling, you'll see back and forth between this idyllic image of Africa and the life of his life and the life of a black man or a black woman in modern society at this time. And so he's struggling back and forth, and he says, what is this? A memory, a reality? Is it my blood, or is it too far removed from me that I don't understand? And so about line 20, he keeps coming back to this idea of I lie. And lie here has a double meaning. Lie can be as in to lay, or lie as in to be lying to myself. So it's really important that he keeps repeating that word lie throughout here. And he eventually goes down. We have this positive imagery of Africa in the first 20 lines or so, and he goes down until that imagery becomes negative. And he says, this dark blood is damned within my flesh, my somber flesh and skin. So we have this very negative connotation. And note how he comes back to this refrain in just a minute. So he talks about, he moves from Africa as this wonderful thing, and now on the bottom of 894 he's saying Africa. So it's questioning the existence of sort of what Africa is. And he says, now it's just nothing more than this book that one kind of casually thumbs through. It's not my heritage, it's just sort of a passing fancy. And if you move over to 895, you'll see that he talks about what is Africa. It's nothing more than, is it nothing more than this snake that you use on your fancy purse and your coat? Is, what is your nakedness to me? He says, essentially saying I've become a quote unquote civilized American. What is this cultural root that I don't understand anymore? And then he goes into about line 48 or so, this very sensual sexual imagery, and he talks about this dripping mangled rain and sweat, the jungle boys and girls in love, and he kind of gives this idea of what he calls savage measures. And he's using the word savage here not in a negative connotation. He's using it in a connotation of saying a primal urge, and that we've lost our ability to give into our primal selves. And we are forgetting the past. And that's what he moves on to down about line 55. He says, how we forget, budding yearly, we must forget how the past arose or set. So we're losing our past. We're losing our culture, he's saying, as Africans. And then he repeats that refrain, 3 centuries removed, what is Africa to me? And then we go back to this idea of lie. So he's connecting this idea of losing oneself to a lie one tells oneself. And he's saying, so I lie and I find no peace. And he feels this unremittent beat. And that's why I really wanted you to note sort of the rhyme scheme and the rhythm here, is this beat, this almost, primal, urgent heartbeat that is coming through the text. And he's saying, I feel this beat. And he's talking about how this beat and this sort of culture within him is keeping him up at night and it's driving him crazy. And it's really starting to come to the surface. And he doesn't know what to do with it. It's as though it's crying out to him, take off your civilized clothes and just be one with the world and one with, your African roots. So if you flip over to 896, move into one more idea here, and that's where he's talking about this idea of Christianity. So he struggles with the idea of Christianity, and he says, quaint, outlandish heathen gods. He says, I don't believe in these. I belong to Jesus Christ. And we're about line 90 now. Preach of humility, heathen gods are not to me. And then he goes on to sort of, he always starts with this statement, and then he more questions it. And he says, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, so I make an idle boast. Jesus of the twice turned cheek. Lamb of God, although I speak. So he talks about, I do play a double part. So while I believe this, it is not necessarily pertinent to me at all times. So he's talking about the idea of this Christianity being almost appropriated by white culture. And he's saying, sometimes I grow sick and I wish that he, God, that I served, were black. So he's saying, not necessarily literally, but he's saying that the white culture has taken this idea of this Christianity, which is rooted in Africa, and this cradle of civilization is what he's arguing, and turned it into their own. And that's a problem. That's what he's lamenting. So he's really giving up at sort of the end. He gives this struggle with faith. He says, Lord, forgive me if my need sometimes shapes a human creed. And then he goes back into this sort of italicized section where he says, at the end, essentially this idea of civilization. What is it to be civilized? And he kind of leaves it ambiguous. All right. From the Dark Tower. This was also the name of the column that he wrote within the magazine. And it's borrowed from Robert Browning's, one of Robert Browning's poems. And it's very interesting because basically he has this focusing on waiting, not necessarily just waiting uselessly, but waiting until the time of equality is coming. And it's coming, but it's taking time. And in that time frame, it's a bitter wait. So again, we have the structured rhyme and meter, a clear end rhyme, back and forth, back and forth. But we see these images of violence. So he says we in these images of natural growth. So he comes back to this point from at the beginning and at the end, and he says we have to plant while others reap. And that's a very clear connection to slavery. And he's saying we plant, others reap. It still happens today, essentially, is what he's saying. And we have these beautiful things, but it's not ours. So we put forth these wonderful artistic movements. We put forth these great ideas, but we don't get to reap the benefits of it because we're still facing all this racial violence. And he's saying it's not going, around line 5, he says it's not everlasting. We're not going to wait forever. We will not always bend to some more subtle brood. We were not made eternally to weep. So the tone of this piece is tragic and heart-wrenching, and he gives us these two forces. He calls these words of power, essentially, is what he's putting forth, and he's saying this brute that is oppressing us. And so he says this idea of night and white and dark is really important. He says the night, relieves the stark. White stars no less lovely being dark. And there are buds that cannot bloom at all in light, but crumple and piteous and fall. So he's saying dark has just as much value as light. White can be, and you understand the double meaning of white here, white can be life-giving, but it can also be cruel, and it takes away life here. And he comes back to this natural imagery at the end. And he says, in the dark, we hide our heart that bleeds and wait and tend our agonizing seeds. So we're just waiting for our seeds to grow, our time to come, and our culture to be whole again. So that was Countee Cullen. I hope you enjoyed it. Go ahead and move on to your next assignment.